I did like a lot of art when I was a kid, and my parents would take me a lot to museums, and they kind of encouraged it as a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, because like a lot of Indian girls learn dance, and they learn art, and they learn piano. So my parents put me in everything, and in ice skating. I don't think they really like expected it to stick to quite the degree it did, but they wanted me to be accomplished and be able to do things like when our family friends came. So that was definitely like kind of different. It was like they didn't really encourage us in sports, except for like they wanted me to ride horses. But it was like definitely a priority for them. I battle a lot with like cultural expectations and ideas of femininity and ideas of like making your own value. My mom had an arranged marriage, and you know, we live in a very different society. My grandmother got married at the age of like 14. So the idea of having like financial independence was sort of equated with having freedom. Yeah. So what happened was very surprising to me. So I was doing art constantly, and I was at this, I was at Columbia's medical school, which is what brought me to New York, which was great. You know, that was, if nothing else, that program has been really good for that. Mm-hmm. But I got married, which was not expected. And he was very supportive, and he's like, you know, just do what's really valuable to you. And that's been helpful in sort of embracing that identity, but it takes a lot of time to get to the point where you're like, I'm okay with this. Because there's a lot of fear in art. You know, a lot of fear in not having a schedule, not having to be so introspective and be aware of what you're doing. So, yeah, so there's a lot of doubt. Even nowadays, like, I have doubts, but I mean, I know that I can't really give it up. Like, you know, when you graduate from high school, you have, like, the sense of continuity. Like, oh, I'm really good at this, I'm going to be doing this. You know, and then we define our lives by different things when we get into adulthood, like how much we make, whether or not we're married, and like really granted stupid things, but they matter. You know, and I think like self-doubt is like, it's not as much a part of like my husband's life, but it's very much a part of being female, because we have to sort of like guard against it. So it's just like been a really interesting journey. But I think the one thing that told me that I wasn't going to do anything but this is that the more that I went along the path to get into doing medicine, the more I became rebellious, and I really balked at the idea of finishing that path. And so I kept, you know, doing art as a way to sustain me and make me feel like whole and happy. And I was like, this is just gonna have to stay. You know, it's just gonna have to be. So, you know, and it's not like a burden, but it is like a love, like a hidden love, like you got married to or you like fell in love with someone who you can't quite quit. My parents' families said you just can't. But in another way, they set me up with these impossible standards. So it sort of led to this dichotomy where they were like, you know, we at least let you do it, but then there's also a lot of like, you know, but we don't really think it's as valuable. So you have like this weird, you know, interplay where it's really not fitting together. And I think also like, when I got into OT, my dad was so happy, and it took them a long time to adjust. Like, I really had to talk them through it about how their expectations for their daughter were based off of their own fears. You know, I remember my mom one time saying to me, she's like, this occupational therapy degree is more important than anything else you'll ever do in your life, even more important than your life. And I was like, nothing's really that important. And I remember talking to her about, like, you know, the more qualified you get to be miserable, what does that give you? You know, or like, you know, the biggest opportunity in your life you'll ever have is to be able to be yourself. And like things that seem obvious but aren't. And I think that's also coming from a society of like loss and not having as much. And it's really different. Like, I try to explain the urgency to people, and then like, you know, I go to India and I see places where women are like beaten and abused, and where they're mistreated, and where like their options are so few that you can't help but say, like, for their reality, this makes sense. And that's something that I have to acknowledge in my own life. You know, like for my mother's reality, it made sense, you know, but for me it doesn't. So how do you decide to, in one way, give up some of your financial power to pursue something that is actually out of the mold and that is putting something on the line? It's like very contradictory. You have to let go of control. It's interesting. So when I went to art school, I was a painter. And then I sort of discovered printmaking in my like second year when I did some bookbinding classes and some letterpress work. which is not what I do at all now. And the thing that I remember about printmaking is, first of all, that it was technically one of the greatest challenges I ever encountered. It was, exacting. The color that you put on the plate would not be what you got, and you had to build it up in layers. And there's also this sort of, a lot of what my husband says is similar in engineering is similar in art. You're doing a lot of troubleshooting with your prints, and you're seeing things out many steps in advance, and you change your process to fit. So the difficulty of it was frustrating, but also fascinating. And then the look of it. It's not like anything else. And even now when I'm combining a little bit of print with painting, there's a look that's just, that's so beautiful in the layering. And it's interesting because my family was in textiles, and I see a lot of similarity in the surface design in textiles. And so I've gone back to a lot of the Indian textiles, and I teach that because it's a way to relate what happens to paper as what happens to fabric. It was just, and I've had very good teachers, very good mentors in printmaking. Female mentors who've taken an interest in where I'm what I'm working towards. And that's made a huge difference because the relationships are paramount to me. My latest series, I'm doing the Intergenerational House Project, which is about female immigration, female immigrants who have had to give up and who have changed different places that they've lived. And so I've documented all the places that they've been in transition. So I know what the building's going to look like. But when I put that together, and I'm shinkling or I'm etching, it changes. There are times where I'm like, this doesn't look right. So a lot of the times you're asking the work, what do you need? And it's sort of, you're looking at it and you're like, this is what it needs. But with this, there's a beautiful unpredictability that sort of shows a kind of uncertainty. And it shows the struggle to find mastery over it, to bring it back to where you want it to be. And that's fun and beautiful. In the past, I've done work with PTSD survivors who have been in India, who have been affected by loss and acts of terrorism and even floods. So it's been more of a global event, but and it has actually focused a lot on my female cousins and my grandmother and their interpretation of those floods, because they were a lot of the victims affected. But now I'm sort of working on really the narratives that women bring into the immigration process, because I've always cared about my parents and my mother's story in particular, because she gave up so much to come here in an age before there was a lot and there was so much expected of her, and she had no support. So I think a lot of her role to be an Indian woman deprived her of opportunities, but also helped shape her. So I was trying to figure out a way to sort of document that without narrative. I was focusing on structure because I've always used buildings. And I realized when I went back to my Haveli, which is an ancestral house in Danol, that she came from a very privileged, different background, where there was a real sense of culture and there was a real sense of art, where she learned from a very fine painter. And so I was looking at that and I was like, this building tells the story. This building in disrepair. It talks about how there was this change in the way that Indians lived, and they moved to these smaller residences and apartments and flats, and there's this globalization and then this migration. So what I did was I'm putting together essentially, I think either woodblocks or monotypes or collagraphs, the three I got open right now, of the different structures she's lived in. And I really want to show transition and uncertainty and kind of make the composition seem a little rickety at certain points and build to where she is now. But I don't think that, where she is now is any more valuable than where she was. So I'd like to open it up to a lot of women who've also been literally who've been refugees, who've been in migration, so I can sort of document where they've stayed literally, and a little bit more about their challenges as women. I've been going through I'm first doing my mother and then my grandmother, and then I've also been talking to a couple of organizations that I have volunteered and sold art for as a donation through the Refugee Project, and I'm trying to work with them to get people who could talk to me. But I'm pretty open at this point, and there are often times where I'll find people have really fascinating stories. Wow. Just from people who are around here. But it's also hard because not everybody has source material of where they've been. So I've been doing a lot of like, you know, I'm kind of doing like an archivist job. I'm looking back and trying to find where this stuff was, which is also its own process because I get like, you know, a lot of weird stuff through Google Maps. It's like, it's also like kind of like what's the interpretation after someone's digging it back up, like the ancestry.com sort of thing, like the going back through things and trying to find a complete picture is distorting. I don't really talk about my personal experience in my art because it gets very narrative, and also I kind of like the ability to step outside of yourself and spend time in peace. Art is peace. So, but I do think it's important to talk about what other people feel, especially if they've got trouble expressing it. So a lot of people wouldn't have identified with that. And I don't really write it into the pieces because I think that there's actually a lot of negative stigma about that. But when you hear about the way that people feel about it and how afraid they are of things happening again, you realize that that is a real part of the way that they felt. You know, I mean, and then there's also, it's interesting, like Indians, I think, do deal with a lot more depth than we do because there is so much more overpopulation, but they also marginalize it a little. So that way they can keep functioning. So, like I remember talking to my cousin who was caught in a taxi for 3 days, like floating in the water, and she saw like women getting like, you know, dragged down under drains, and she couldn't do anything because if she opened the windows, she would have, you know, been dragged under the current. And then there was like, you know, my uncle who was looking through every train that was like waterlogged for my grandparents, and then, and you know, I think like a lot of these experiences are similar to like the ones that people face during Sandy. But, you know, I don't know how much people get to like voice it or talk about it or really think about it. You know, I've got cousins that move every year now, depending upon the water level. And that's only going to get worse as we sort of, you know, move through the future and with global warming. So it's definitely something that I think is existentially and literally terrifying. And it's interesting because I started with a kind of impersonal event. I started with the Dodge Hotel. And I looked a lot into like what had happened there, but then I went back to my uncle's interview because he was supposed to be checked in that day, and at the last moment he moved to a different hotel because they didn't have a room. But he ended up watching it pretty much like personally across from where it occurred, and so we saw a lot of people getting, you know, hurt and a lot of people coming in and out, and the TV coverage of that actually was heavily criticized because it was so detailed that they were saying that the terrorists were getting information from the TV coverage about what was going on outside. And but it's like, it's also interesting because that was like my only source of information. I had like this moment where I was like, I really want to know, but I also understand what they're saying. And it's also just very surreal, like anything that happens to people that are very far away, like when you find out or how you find out, what you were doing when that was occurring. Mm-hmm. And how little it was covered here. So there's just this huge disconnect. But I mean, I think the thing that was really valuable was getting the opportunity to actually talk to people because they're not always very transparent about it. Yeah. And then sort of figuring out a way to like memorialize it in a respectful manner. So I used a lot of imagery of water. I looked at like the work of Ronnie Horn that uses a lot of like images of water to represent suicide because people drown themselves in the rivers she was portraying. I looked at the way that you could make water ominous. I looked at building silhouettes and how you could submerge them. And then I also countered them with other people's happy memories of that to sort of have a dynamic contrast, which was also kind of positive for them. A lot of it was in the suggestion of violence. A lot of like actually my therapy experience has really benefited my ability to communicate with people because if you're not empathetic and listening constantly, you're invalidating. I think like in the work there's a sense of resolution for me because I'm looking for truth. Yeah. You know, obviously there's not a sense of resolution for the event, and you know I'm lucky to have that because I think a lot of people like when they create memorials or when they create a structure that provides people with a place to go, they have this sense of closure, which is so powerful for people who don't have like, you know, victims or a way to actually see people that they have lost. And so I think that's really important, but I don't know if that's the experience of everyone.